Okay, welcome everyone to this final session in our philosophy track. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our next and final speaker, Šimon Král, who is a student currently pursuing an MSc in Psychological Sciences at University College London. He holds a BA in Philosophy from Trinity College Dublin, first-class honours, and wrote an undergraduate dissertation on psychedelic experience and the alleviation of death anxiety, which explores the potential of understanding the effectiveness of psychedelic-assisted therapy for existential anxiety through the framework of Heidegger's philosophy and existential psychotherapy. In addition to his academic pursuits, Šimon has gained valuable experience in the field of psychedelic research. He's a research collaborator at the National Institute of Mental Health in the Czech Republic and is working on a study assessing the effects of psilocybin and ketamine on existential anxiety in terminally ill patients. Finally, he's also on the committee of the UCL Society for the Application of Psychedelics. Over to you, Šimon.
Thank you, Chris, for the very exhaustive introduction. Today I will talk about the psychedelic experience through the lens of the releasement of death anxiety. I'm sure a lot of you have been here for Chris's lecture at the beginning of the day, talking about neuroexistentialism. So hopefully this is going to be a kind of complementary perspective. Also, I just came from the main auditorium where there was an interesting discussion of death as a part of the psychedelic experience. So hopefully this will lead on nicely from that. I also have to make a brief statement that this talk might induce death anxiety in some people. So I think that's kind of a necessary part of the process, but take that as you will. This is kind of a invitation to meditate on the fact that I believe we're all mortals, and eventually we all in this room are going to die. And I think this is an important fact to recognize, and has been a part of philosophy since its inception, and has been a part of human existence for as long as there has been human existence. So, death as central to human existence and philosophy. So the first quote I have here is actually from the oldest surviving text that we have from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which deals extensively with the topic of death and immortality. So this is a quote from Gilgamesh after his friend Enkidu dies. It says, "Thou hast become dark and cannot hear me. When I die, shall I not be like Enkidu? Sorrow enters my heart. I am afraid of death." So here we see that this problem has really been a part of humans as long as we have written records. And this became kind of it was understood as an important and main problem of philosophy, at least in the Greek conception of philosophy. It was important to come to terms with death, and maybe understanding death as a philosophical problem might help us understand how to face it. So Socrates himself claimed that philosophy itself is kind of training for dying in the Phaedo. And importantly, Socrates himself was not afraid to die when he was sentenced to death or exile from Athens. He chose to drink the poison hemlock. And before he drinks it, he says that those who pursue philosophy study nothing but dying and being dead. So psychedelics are, I think, also connected to death traditionally. So one of the translations of ayahuasca, which I'm not an expert on this, so this might be wrong, but one of them that I found is the Liana of the Dead. There is also, of course, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which has been adapted by the psychedelic counterculture in the 60s by Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert into a psychedelic manual. The translation I found for the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Bardo Todol, is the liberation through hearing during the intermediate state, referring to the state between life and death and the various states of dying. And then there's, of course, even in the Greek world, the Eleusinian mysteries, which are mentioned by Plato in the Phaedo as well. And there are speculative theories that psychedelics were part of the potion Kukion that was drank during these secret mysteries. This is just a quote from Plutarch, who was also an initiate of the mysteries, talking about the connection and experience of death in these mysteries. So this is just an amphora with symbolism of the mysteries which concern the goddesses Demeter and Persephone, and this legend and the experience in the mysteries contains a kind of passage into the underworld and then coming back to life. Those are some symbols of the mysteries here. We see grain as a symbol of Demeter, and here this would be the potion Kukion that was drank. So going to fast forwarding a little bit to Heidegger, who thought that being towards death defines, or is a part of what defines human beings as Dasein. Again, I actually don't speak German, so I think many people might be able to correct my understanding here, so please feel free to do that. So, yeah, Dasein is translated variously as being there, and it's also limited by time and our awareness of our own limited time in this world. And this manifests for Heidegger as anxiety, for the groundlessness of being and its kind of finitude. And anxiety puts Dasein, us, face to face with the nothing. However, facing this nothing, facing death, also allows authentic living for Heidegger. He says, if I take death into my life, I will free myself of the anxiety of death. So this kind of perspective on death has also been adapted by existential psychology and psychotherapy, who draw on Heidegger, people like Rollo May and Irvin Yalom. Death anxiety can also be understood as a trans-diagnostic construct. In psychopathology, there's been studies on how it might manifest in different conditions. And within existential psychotherapy, a confrontation with mortality is seen as something that can promote an authentic immersion in life and an enhanced well-being. There's also been work on how culture, here especially Western culture, manages humanity's repressed terror of death. So there's terror management theory of Ernst Becker, where he actually claims that all of culture is motivated by kind of suppressing the fear of death and kind of pushing it down. And there's also some cross-cultural studies that find the death anxiety to be universal. So psychedelics, I believe, also can resemble death-like experiences. I have a quote here from Stanislav Grof, the Czech important early psychedelic researcher, that psychedelics can promote experiential confrontation with death. Ego dissolution, as we know, it can be part of the psychedelic experience, can be akin to dying. And interestingly, there's been recent research semantically comparing trip reports on various psychedelics and other substances to near-death experiences by Marshall et al. In 2019, and they found strong similarities between psychedelic experiences and near-death experiences as reported by people that have experienced them. And also they found ego dissolution as an important part of NDE phenomenology. And there's also research that shows that near-death experiences, so this is people coming very close to actual death, I forgot to say, where people often have interesting phenomenology, which often leads them to be less afraid of death. So paradoxically, the closer you actually come to die, the less afraid you often are in the end. So this is taken from the Marshall et al. Study, and basically it's comparing many different substances and the similarity in the semantic analysis of the trip reports with reports of near-death experiences. So here we have highest similarity, which are these substances here. Actually, ketamine has been found to be most similar, a kind of non-traditional psychedelics. There's also salvia divinorum here, but we have LSD, 5-MeO-DMT, psilocybin, and so on. So there's even an empirical connection between psychedelics and at least coming close to death. But actually, as was mentioned in the discussion in the auditorium, it is important to keep in mind that coming close to dying or having ego dissolution experience actually is not the same thing as dying. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. But yeah, so using psychedelics with people that are truly close to death, patients in palliative care. There's been at least 4 recent randomized controlled trials of psilocybin and LSD with psychological support. Thank you. Yeah, so there's been some randomized controlled trials in recent years, and these were actually following from many trials already done in the 60s that found improvements in death anxiety in terminally ill patients. And these randomized controlled trials established safety and preliminary efficacy with medium to large reductions in death anxiety. And a different study that followed up with these patients that survived up to 4.5 years after a single dose psilocybin session, these effects in the reduction of death anxiety were sustained. It's a very strong finding. And so now we get back to Heidegger. So where we left, he was just kind of telling us to stare straight into the face of death, into anxiety, which might seem a little bit uncomfortable. But he actually has an answer for us in the concept of Gelassenheit, which is translated into English as releasement. It's his kind of later answer to Angst. And it can be understood as a releasement into the nothing. Also, we can understand as a releasement of will, releasement of control, releasement of the ego, everything that kind of is within us that wants to keep hold of life, and everything that we know. It's actually a term appropriated from the Christian philosopher and mystic Master Eckhart, and it's associated with an acceptance of things, a detachment, and a certain non-willing, also a meditative thinking and a way of life open to mystery. So this term is actually quite strongly connected to Zen Buddhism and Eastern philosophy as well. So Heidegger was in contact with Zen Buddhists as early as the 1920s. This is Heidegger with D.T. Suzuki, the very important Japanese Zen philosopher. And there are very strong similarities in certain Zen attitudes and the concept of Gelassenheit. Interestingly, in relation to death and ego death, there is a Zen saying of become a dead man, remaining alive, become thoroughly dead, then do as your mind please. All your works are then good. So ego death might be a kind of way of increasing our morality as well. And it's also showing here that ego death is an ongoing process, right? So becoming a dead man continuously, it's not just taking psychedelics once. So this is connected to various practices like meditation. And here is another Japanese philosopher writing about Heidegger's concept. So he says, through the deepening conversion from anxiety threatened by the nothing to Gelassenheit, as releasing oneself into the nothing, by going from the nothing of Angst to the nothing of Gelassenheit, and through this releasement becoming able to die, one is first truly able to be and able to let things be. So this is a profound connection here between being able to actually be and to live fully and being able to die at the same time. Perhaps there's metaphors of taking a breath in as living and taking a breath out as dying. We do all take our first breath when we're born and then the last breath when we die. And this attitude, I think, can also be applied to psychedelics. Surrender has been understood as a very good attitude to take in psychedelic states within the recent clinical trials and research into psychedelic therapy. And Heidegger tells us he would probably be a decent trip sitter. Says, wait, listen, ponder, be patient. Mindfulness and acceptance, commitment therapy are all kind of aligned well with Gelassenheit, I believe. And applying this concept of releasement, this is not really a concept, it's this kind of attitude that one can get to within an ego dissolution experience more broadly, can then be integrated into an ongoing mindfulness practices that might sustain this process of becoming a dead man, but also being truly alive. So we can apply this releasement experience more broadly into life, and it might allow more authentic and fuller living. This is a quote from the existential psychotherapist Irvin Yalom. The more unlived your life, the greater your death anxiety. The more you fail to experience your life fully, the more you will fear death. And the last quote here in this very quote-heavy presentation This is actually from Stanislav Grof and his book, The Human Encounter with Death. And he writes of Leonardo da Vinci's last words recorded by his student. Leonardo apparently said, "I thought I was living, I was only preparing myself to die." And Rabbi Limon, who was the patient in Stanislav Grof's LSD trial, mirrored these words during his ego-death experience, saying, "I thought I was dying, I was only preparing myself to live." That's it.
All right, thanks very much, Šimon. Do we have a question? Yes. Christine. Is there a mic around here somewhere? I think if you have the mic, then it'll go on the recording.
Thank you. What you've been saying is very different from what I've been saying, but that aside, if you sort of take psychedelic experiences as a sort of making one's peace with mortality, one's own mortality, then of course there is not only anecdotal evidence that especially in young people who are severely depressed and are going into ketamine clinics, the suicide risk actually increases because the own death has lost a lot of the worry about it. So there is a way in which this only works if you don't have severe, if there is no romanticization of death, if you have people who are not already toying with the idea of hastening death. It's one thing to wait patiently, and I think that's a bit boring. I'd rather do more, and I'm happy with this last quote you had, preparing to live and now do something. But this question of hastening death through this acceptance, I want you to comment on that, please.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And I have actually read about this, so I should have thought about this more. It would be interesting if it's ketamine that then romanticizes ideas of death. Perhaps I would hope that there would be something else within the experience that would lead to a more full engagement with life as well. But perhaps this is not a universal treatment for everybody. And I think there is a big difference of using psychedelics, for example, in palliative care, preparing people to come to terms with their own mortality as they're 70 years old, and when somebody is 17 years old. Those are very different stages of life. And so the context of the therapy is going to be very important. This was sort of an attempt to explore the parallels of the themes between death and psychedelics and death anxiety. But if what people have is a kind of anxiety from living, perhaps this is something that's even a modern phenomenon, which we can't really maybe go to Plato for this, and we need to think differently because the conditions have changed drastically. But yeah, I would not want to promote assisted or any other kind of suicide in young people, of course.
Any questions from online? No questions online? All right, more questions in the room. Yes.
It's not really a question. It's more an experience I had of being many years a young, depressed teenager, playing with death, being obsessed with death, working with the dying. And a couple of months ago, actually having a deadly illness that I survived. And I can just say that the most profound thing is to live fully. That is now what I'm obsessed with, is to have a full experience. But what I can say, looking back, what was helpful is to be really in touch with profound practices of learning being, and what you refer to as the connectedness, and the obsession with death, and also psychedelic experiences with near death. They came actually more out of a pathology of this depressed young teenager and carrying on the depression. If somebody had shown me a way how my soul could live fully when I was young, it would have taken a whole greater joyful experience.
Thank you. Did you have a comment on that, Šimon?
No, thank you for sharing. And yeah, it also shows that there is a difference between actual death and our sort of fantasies, which I guess ego death experience is somewhere in between. And I think it also shows that maybe times have actually changed substantially since what was taken to be important spiritual wisdom, and maybe we need more experiences of a full life. But a lot of the literature of psychedelic existential psychotherapy talks about people who, when they're confronted with their own mortality in a terminal diagnosis or so, some of the people become depressed and they have this kind of death anxiety. And some people actually feel more alive than ever. So there's obviously an individual component to this, and people react differently to different situations.
Thanks. Do we have one more question? Anyone in the room? Yes, up the front here.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment a little bit on like both of the topics. I was, as far as I know, the ketamine has actually an anti-suicidal effect. So I was curious about your comment that, but it was in studies for adults. I don't know if for adolescents that might change, but also like relating this thing with the romanticization of death. I think during the adolescence, it's an experience to be faced with mortality that is common and it has to be like crossed over. And I think psychedelics may, yeah, it's a dangerous point, may help to do this. And in the end, as the past question or comment said, give it a chance of keeping the idea of, yeah, we will die, but also at the same time, I can, in the meanwhile, have this full life, and this experience is has an end, and that's why it's valuable. That is what is so related to mindfulness at the same time.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. There's also an important connection that maybe I haven't emphasized enough in, for example, literature on existential psychotherapy, connecting the fear of death to the fear of life. So perhaps they're kind of two sides of the same coin, and a kind of fascination with death might be a kind of fear of life manifesting itself as an obsession with death. So it's always about balance and the middle way and so on. But I think what also is, what is shown in some studies, and I think is kind of apparent in Western society, there isn't that much talk of death and the way that people die. This was actually discussed in the forum in the auditorium by David Yaden. The way that people die and how they imagine they would like to die is often very, very different. The kind of the hospital environment and the kind of medical system often trying to prolong life at all costs. I think it shows something about maybe it's just an immaturity or non-wise relationship with death that can manifest in different extremes.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the philosophy session for this morning. Thanks, everyone, for your participation. And